Welcome to Momentum Mind, the place where ideas spark action and stories transform the way you think. Today, we're diving into a world of hidden patterns, untold family secrets, and the invisible forces shaping your mind and your life. So get comfortable, open your mind, and let's uncover the wisdom that can change everything. Chapter 1: The shadows we carry. The town of Lyra seemed ordinary at first glance. Sunlight spilled over cobbled streets, shopkeepers hummed as they arranged their wares, and the scent of fresh bread floated from corner bakeries. But for Mara, the world had always felt off-kilter, as if she were walking through a place that belonged to someone else. She could see the brightness around her, but inside, she carried a shadow she could not shake. Since childhood, Mara had felt a heavy presence lurking behind her thoughts, whispering doubts she could never place. Every relationship ended in quiet explosions, every plan she made dissolved into chaos, and a persistent ache followed her, unclaimed and unexplainable. She had tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just her own clumsiness, her own temper, her own failure to fit in. But the shadow remained. One evening, she wandered into the town's old library, a towering structure with spiraling staircases and walls lined with dusty tomes. There, among the forgotten scrolls and cracked leather bindings, she found a book that seemed to hum in her hands. Its pages whispered stories of people whose lives mirrored her own, stories of unseen burdens passed down through generations. Mara felt her pulse quicken, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. As she read, she began to see her own life through a new lens. The anger that flared in her at small slights, the sadness that followed her like a silent companion, the fear of repeating mistakes she could not remember, these were not hers alone. They were echoes of a past she had never lived but had somehow inherited. The words spoke of family patterns, unspoken secrets, and emotional legacies that could trap people across time. Mara's mind raced with questions. How could a feeling, an ache, a fear belong to her ancestors? How could events she had no memory of shape the person she had become? The library around her seemed to hum with answers, the walls pressing in as if eager for her to understand. She felt a shiver run down her spine as the realization hit. The shadow inside her might not be hers to carry, but it might be hers to release. Her hand trembled as she turned the page, revealing stories of people who had faced these invisible chains. Some had faltered, weighed down until life itself seemed too heavy to bear. Others had discovered hidden keys, memories, emotions, and truths long buried, that allowed them to step into sunlight again. The possibility of freedom dazzled Mara, yet a creeping fear gripped her. The deeper she went, the more she sensed she would have to confront things she did not understand, things hidden in the dark corners of her family's history. And then, almost as if the library itself had been waiting for her, a name appeared on the page, her mother's mother, her grandmother, a figure Mara barely remembered. The story hinted at a secret, a fracture in the family that no one had spoken of, an event that had rippled silently through generations. Mara's heart thumped in her chest. She had always thought she had lost control of her life because of her own choices, but what if her choices were influenced by something older, deeper, invisible? The air in the library grew heavier, the shadows longer, and Mara felt the first real tremor of fear and excitement she had known in years. She realized she could not turn away now. The answers were here, buried in family echoes, and somewhere in the stories lay a way to claim her own life free from shadows. She closed the book and pressed it to her chest, feeling the weight of generations as if it were a pulse inside her own body. Outside, the town of Lyra seemed unchanged, the streets glowing in evening light, but Mara knew something within her had shifted. The shadow was no longer just a whisper, it was a call, demanding that she uncover the truths hidden beneath the smiles, the silences, the ordinary days, and somewhere, deep in her chest, she felt a small spark. If she could find the secrets, confront the patterns, and release what was not hers, perhaps the shadow would finally lift. But the path to those answers was unclear, winding through memories she could not yet touch and stories she could barely imagine. Mara stepped out of the library and into the cool evening air, the book clutched to her chest. The cobbled streets seemed quieter now, as if the town itself were holding its breath. She did not know where to begin, or if she could bear what she might discover, but she could feel the stirrings of a journey that would change everything. Somewhere ahead, a truth waited, tangled in shadows and light, and it would not let her go until she followed it. And then she saw it, a figure standing across the street, just for a moment, a familiar face she had not seen in years. Mara froze. A memory, or was it a premonition, flashed before her eyes, and in that instant, she felt the pull of something enormous, something hidden, something that would not let her rest. The shadow was calling, and Mara knew she had no choice but to follow. Chapter 2: Whispers beneath the surface. Mara woke to a strange quiet. The streets of Lyra were empty, wrapped in a fog that blurred the edges of the town, softening the familiar shapes of houses and lampposts. She still clutched the book to her chest, the pages warm and heavy with unseen energy. Every word she had read yesterday seemed to hum inside her mind, repeating itself in patterns she could almost hear like whispers. She had tried to dismiss the fleeting figure she had seen the night before, telling herself it was a trick of the light, a memory twisting itself into the present. But as she walked through the fog-laden streets, she felt it again, a pull, subtle but insistent, leading her toward the river that cut through the town. The river had always been ordinary, a place children splashed in during summer and fishermen cast nets in at dawn. But today, it felt different. The water glimmered strangely, reflecting not only the mist but shadows that seemed to move independently of the current. Mara approached the edge, heart tight with anticipation and unease. She opened the book again, and this time, the pages seemed to guide her. They spoke of hidden echoes, of feelings and memories passed silently through generations. The stories described how grief, anger, shame, and fear could nestle into the soul, almost like seeds waiting to sprout, carried not by choice but by blood, by invisible bonds. Mara's fingers trembled as she traced the lines, realizing for the first time that some of the sadness she had always believed was hers alone belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had lived long before she was born. She thought of her grandmother, whose smiles had always seemed fragile, like glass about to shatter. And she thought of her mother, whose quiet bursts of frustration had puzzled Mara her entire life. The river whispered to her, or perhaps it was her own imagination echoing the lessons in the book. She remembered fragments of family stories she had long ignored, a house abandoned in anger, a sudden departure that had left emptiness in its wake, a sorrow never spoken aloud but always present. The book suggested that when trauma is not expressed, it travels invisibly, shaping lives that come after. Mara shivered, compelled by something she could not name. She walked along the riverbank until she reached a small wooden dock. It looked ancient, its boards warped and splintered, yet something about it felt inviting, as if it were meant to hold secrets. She set the book down and knelt, letting her hands brush the cool water. The surface trembled, reflecting images she could not fully grasp, faces she knew, faces she had never met, emotions that were not hers but carried a familiar weight. Mara felt a surge of emotion, sorrow, anger, longing, all tangled together in a single pulse. She realized she had been living under the influence of these invisible currents, repeating patterns she could not explain. The book had named them, but now the river was showing her how they moved through her body, through her mind, through the life she had always thought was her own. Suddenly, the water shimmered and a new image appeared, a figure, blurred at first, then sharper, her grandmother as a young woman, eyes full of fear and determination. Mara saw her making choices that Mara herself had unknowingly mirrored. Every anger she had felt, every fear, every hesitation in her own life reflected moments that had belonged to someone else. The river seemed to whisper that these were not just memories, they were legacies, living inside her even when they should have ended decades ago. Mara's chest tightened. If the past could reach into her so completely, could she ever untangle herself from it? And if she could, what would remain of her life when the inherited shadows were peeled away? The book had promised a path, but now the river, the fog, the shimmering images suggested that path would be neither easy nor safe. A sudden splash startled her. She looked up and saw nothing, only the river rippling as if something beneath had moved. Then, a voice, faint and almost human, seemed to drift across the water. "You cannot hide from what you carry." Mara's heart pounded. She wanted to run, to escape the weight of discovery, but something rooted her in place. The river was offering a truth she could not ignore. The past lived, breathed, and waited for acknowledgment. To confront it would mean walking into memories not her own, feeling grief not hers, facing fear that had been passed silently from hand to hand, heart to heart. And then she saw it, a small wooden chest, half buried in mud at the edge of the dock. She didn't remember seeing it before. With hands shaking, she pulled it free and opened it. Inside were letters, photographs, and a worn journal, all belonging to her grandmother. The handwriting was beautiful and trembling, full of emotion that leapt off the page. Mara picked up the journal, and as she read the first words, a sudden clarity struck her. The answers, the shadows, and the keys to freedom were all here, waiting to be understood. But as she turned another page, her eyes widened in shock. One entry described a choice her grandmother had made, a choice that Mara realized had rippled across the decades, touching lives, shaping destinies, and whispering through generations. The weight of it pressed against her chest, a heavy, invisible hand. And at the very end of the page, a single line, incomplete, hinted at a secret that had never been spoken aloud, a danger that still lingered, threatening to pull Mara deeper into the currents of inherited pain. Mara's breath caught. She felt the river beside her, the fog around her, the pulse of her ancestors beneath her skin. The journey she had begun was no longer a quiet discovery, it was a confrontation with forces she could barely imagine, forces that would not release her without truth. And in that moment, as the mist curled around her and the journal whispered its secrets, Mara realized that the next step, stepping fully into her family's hidden past, might change everything, and might not let her return the same person she had been. Chapter 3, The Echoes of Choices. Mara carried the journal carefully as she walked through the foggy streets of Lyra. The town seemed smaller now, shrunken under the weight of silence and secrets. Each cobblestone under her feet felt imbued with memory, as if the past itself had settled into the cracks and was now whispering to her. She found a quiet bench in the town square, the one where sunlight would normally warm her skin. Today, though, the light was muted, drifting weakly through the fog, giving everything a dreamlike, fragile quality. Mara opened the journal again and began to read the entries more closely. Her grandmother's words were full of longing, regret, and fierce determination, an emotional map of a life Mara had never known. It was not only the events that struck Mara, but the choices her grandmother had made. Decisions taken in desperation or love had carried consequences far beyond their time, shaping relationships, creating wounds, and leaving trails of invisible weight. As Mara read, she noticed patterns she recognized in herself, moments of sudden anxiety, anger, or sadness, triggered without reason, as if an invisible hand had scripted her reactions long before she existed. The realization struck her with almost unbearable clarity: the pain she had carried was not hers alone. It had traveled silently, passing through generations, and now it had taken shape inside her. Every hesitation, every fear, every subtle act of self-sabotage was connected to choices she could never remember, events she had never witnessed, yet that existed like echoes in the corridors of her mind. Mara closed her eyes, feeling the presence of those echoes, almost tangible, swirling in the air around her. She imagined them as threads of silver, winding through the streets, through the houses, through her own body. Some threads were light, delicate, almost imperceptible, others were dark, knotted, heavy, pulling at her very essence. She wondered how many of her decisions had been guided not by her own will, but by the invisible influence of her grandmother's unspoken pain. The thought made her shiver. Yet amid the fear, a strange excitement stirred. If these threads could be traced, if the echoes could be understood, perhaps they could also be unraveled. Perhaps she could reclaim her life, one choice at a time. Mara's fingers trembled as she turned the pages of the journal, reading about a night her grandmother had spent in solitude, wrestling with fear, shame, and a secret she could not share. The entry ended abruptly, leaving Mara with an image of a heavy door closed against the world. She felt as if she could almost hear the door creaking under invisible pressure, holding stories that longed to escape. Determined, Mara decided she had to follow the threads where they led. She retraced her grandmother's steps as best she could, wandering through old streets, abandoned houses, and hidden gardens that seemed to exist only for those who knew their secrets. Everywhere she went, Mara felt the presence of those who had come before her, their emotions brushing against her like invisible wings, sometimes soothing, sometimes jarring. One evening, she arrived at an old house at the edge of town, half hidden behind wild ivy. It had belonged to her grandmother long ago. The windows were dusty, the door creaking on its hinges, but inside, the air smelled of memories, warm bread, waxed floors, and something faintly metallic, like unspoken anger. Mara stepped inside, the journal clutched tightly to her chest, and felt a current of energy sweep through the rooms. The living room was frozen in time, dust motes drifting in the fading light. Photographs lined the walls, smiling faces that had aged, faces that had disappeared, faces that seemed to watch her, expectant and patient. Mara ran her fingers along the edges of the frames, and suddenly a whisper reached her ears, almost inaudible: "Remember what we could not." Mara's heart pounded. She realized that the echoes were more than patterns, they were messages, attempts from the past to reach her, to warn her, to guide her. Every choice her grandmother had made, every pain unspoken, was like a signal sent across time, waiting for someone to understand. Then, in the corner of the room, Mara noticed a small mirror, cracked and darkened by age. She approached it and saw not only her reflection but a flicker of another presence behind her, a shadowed figure, bending and twisting in ways that mimicked her movements yet were subtly off. Mara gasped. She understood immediately: this was not her own shadow alone, but the echo of the choices that had shaped her, an imprint left by her grandmother's life. The figure's movements became clearer, more insistent, almost like it was trying to show her something. Mara watched as the shadow traced a path through the mirror, a silent map of decisions and consequences, some joyful, some tragic. She realized that to free herself, she would have to confront these echoes directly, to feel what they had felt, to untangle her life from the invisible chains that had bound her. As she reached out to touch the mirror, the shadow recoiled, then suddenly lunged, and Mara stumbled backward. The journal slipped from her hands, pages splaying open across the floor. One entry caught her eye, and she froze. The words were unmistakable, describing an event that had been kept secret, a moment of betrayal and pain that had shaped her grandmother's entire life. And at the bottom of the page, a note in faint, trembling script warned: "Some truths may follow you farther than you expect." Mara's pulse raced. She realized the echoes were not only memories, they were alive, present in the world, capable of influencing her reality until they were understood. And as the shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, merging with the evening light, Mara understood something terrifying and exhilarating. Her journey had only just begun, and the next step would take her deeper into the labyrinth of the past than she had ever imagined. Chapter 4. Walking in another's shoes. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through Mara's window, painting the room in soft gold, but inside her, a storm had already begun. She awoke with a sense that the world was not entirely hers, that invisible footsteps followed her, that unseen eyes watched her from corners she could not name. The journal lay on her bedside table, open to a page she hadn't finished reading the night before. She could still see her grandmother's shadow in the mirror, hear the whisper of warnings carried across time. And now, as she dressed and stepped into the town streets, Mara realized the echoes were no longer confined to memories, they were reaching into her daily life. A sudden rush of anger at a stranger, a pang of grief while passing a laughing child, an inexplicable dread in a familiar shop, these were not her own feelings, yet they coursed through her like a second heartbeat. Determined to understand, Mara returned to the river, the place where she had first glimpsed the threads of the past. The water shimmered differently today, alive with hints of emotion, twisting and curling as if aware of her presence. She knelt at the edge, letting her fingers brush the surface. A ripple spread, carrying visions she could not fully control. She saw her grandmother's life unfold like a hidden stage. The young woman's laughter, fragile and fleeting, danced in the sunlight, her sorrow, heavy and relentless, shadowed every decision. Mara felt herself stepping into these moments, feeling the fear and hope that had shaped a life she had never lived. It was intoxicating and terrifying. As if she had become a vessel for the emotions of someone long gone, Mara began to understand how deeply the echoes could reach. They were not just memories, they were living forces, shaping behavior, coloring perception, guiding decisions in ways invisible to the conscious mind. And now, for the first time, she felt their weight directly pressing on her, entwining with her own. Back in town, the ordinary world felt strange, dissonant. She spoke to friends and family, noticing how tiny triggers brought out reactions she had thought were entirely her own. A careless remark, a gesture of impatience, a look of disappointment, all of them sparked intense feelings, sometimes of rage, sometimes of grief, sometimes of inexplicable sorrow. Mara realized that she had been carrying not only her own experiences but the unspoken burdens of her grandmother's life, and perhaps of generations before her. As the day wore on, she returned to the old house at the edge of town, journal in hand, desperate for guidance. The rooms were quiet, dust motes dancing in the fading light. Mara wandered from one space to another, letting herself feel what the house held. In the kitchen, she smelled bread baking in an oven long gone. In the bedroom, she felt the ache of sleepless nights. In the study, the tension of decisions made under duress. Each sensation was a thread connecting her to someone she had never truly met, yet whose life coursed through her veins. In the corner of the study, Mara noticed a locked drawer. Something about it called to her, a pulse of energy that mirrored her own heartbeat. She fumbled with the lock until it clicked open, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were addressed not to her grandmother, but from her, to a person Mara did not recognize. The handwriting was trembling, full of emotion, and as Mara read, she felt herself stepping into the writer's mind, living the secrecy, the fear, the desperate hope for understanding. One letter, in particular, froze her blood. It described a choice made under unbearable pressure, a moment of betrayal disguised as protection, a secret that had shaped lives in ways Mara was only beginning to comprehend. As she read, the air in the room seemed to thicken, and Mara realized that the echoes were not passive, they were alive, demanding recognition, demanding confrontation. Suddenly, a sound at the door startled her. She turned to see no one, yet the room felt charged with movement, as if the house itself were alive with memories trying to communicate. The journal vibrated in her hands, a low hum, as if urging her forward. She realized she could not stop now, the threads were winding tighter around her, pulling her into the depths of her family's hidden history. Mara's mind raced. If she allowed herself to fully feel these echoes, to step completely into the lives of those who had come before, would she lose herself? Or would she finally find the strength to reclaim her life, untangling the patterns that had haunted her for so long? The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to make a choice, and somewhere deep inside, Mara knew the next step would not be easy, and might not be safe. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, dark and waiting, as if they were alive with anticipation. Mara's pulse quickened. She had taken her first steps into another's life, felt the weight of unspoken trauma, and now she stood on the edge of discovery, not knowing what truths would confront her next, or what forces would rise to challenge her. And then, from the shadows of the hallway, a whisper echoed, soft and insistent, yet unmistakably familiar, "You have begun to remember." But remembering is only the beginning. Mara froze. She understood instantly that the journey ahead would not only reveal hidden pain but might also awaken something that had waited too long to be seen. Chapter 5. The Weight of Generations. That night, Mara slept fitfully, her dreams thick with shadows and half-formed voices. She wandered through visions of streets she had never walked, rooms she had never entered, and faces that seemed familiar yet impossible. In these dreams, time did not flow normally. Moments from decades ago and memories she could not claim merged seamlessly with her own experiences. She woke in a cold sweat, heart hammering, with the sense that the past was no longer distant, it was pressing down on her, close and tangible. By morning, Mara could no longer ignore the weight she carried. Each step through Lyra's streets felt heavier, as if invisible hands pressed against her shoulders. She carried the journal in her bag, reading and rereading pages, searching for clues about the choices, secrets, and pain embedded in her grandmother's life. The more she read, the more she began to sense that the shadows she had always felt were not only her own, they were echoes of generations, each one layering grief, fear, and regret on the next. Determined to understand, Mara returned to the old house at the edge of town. She opened the journal to a chapter she had not yet explored. It described the lives of several ancestors, great-grandparents, aunts and uncles she had never met, all bound by decisions, silences, and long-hidden sorrows. As she read, Mara felt herself walking through their experiences, feeling the choices they had made as if they were her own. Anger, shame, longing, and despair twisted inside her like threads being pulled taut. The house itself seemed to respond. Doors creaked, shadows shifted, and faint murmurs filled the rooms. Mara realized that the echoes she had felt at the river and in the mirror were not isolated, they were everywhere, saturating the very spaces her family had inhabited. The emotions, the patterns, the regrets, they were woven into the walls, the floors, the air. She felt their pull in her chest, their whispers in her mind, their weight in her hands as she touched the furniture, the photographs, the letters. Mara walked to the staircase, feeling the tremor of history beneath her feet. Each step seemed to vibrate with memory. She climbed slowly, pausing to touch the railing, noticing faint scratches left by hands long gone. The upper floor was darker, the air cooler, carrying the faint scent of lavender and old paper. She entered a room filled with photographs and keepsakes. Each one seemed to pulse, alive with the lives they had captured, frozen yet urgent. As Mara studied the images, she noticed connections between the faces, expressions repeated, postures mirrored, gestures passed silently from one generation to the next. She realized that not only were emotions inherited, but patterns of behavior, fears, and desires were transmitted invisibly, guiding lives in ways people rarely recognized. She felt a shiver run down her spine. If these patterns could reach her now, could they also influence the choices she made tomorrow? Then she discovered a hidden compartment in the wall, just large enough for a small bundle of papers. Inside were letters and diaries she had never seen before. The handwriting varied, but all carried the same tremor of intensity, the same unspoken urgency. Mara felt herself drawn into them, reading stories of secrecy, betrayal, courage, and despair. Each account revealed decisions made under pressure, sacrifices unspoken, and pain carried silently, rippling outward to affect those yet to come. Mara realized that she was not merely learning about her ancestors, she was feeling their lives, their choices, their regrets. It was as if the echoes had chosen her to witness, to feel, to understand. And with understanding came responsibility. If she could trace these patterns, could she also break them? Could she untangle herself from generations of inherited weight? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Her hands trembled as she turned another page. One entry described an event so profound that it seemed to resonate with every echo she had felt in her life. A betrayal, a decision made to protect someone, a secret kept out of love but burdened with fear and shame. Mara felt it in her chest as though the room itself had taken a breath and exhaled sorrow. She could feel the invisible threads binding her, pulling her toward the choices of her ancestors, binding her to patterns she had long thought were hers alone. Suddenly, a noise startled her. A drawer slammed shut across the room, though she had not touched it. Mara's pulse quickened, and she realized with a jolt that the house itself was alive with memory, echoing the emotions of those who had lived there. Every whisper, every movement, every shadow seemed to demand attention, to insist that she see and feel what had been hidden for so long. Mara took a deep breath and pressed her hands to the walls, letting the vibrations of the past flow into her fingertips. She felt the weight of generations, the sorrows, the regrets, the hopes that had been carried silently. And in that moment, she understood something profound. To free herself, she would not only have to uncover the truths, she would have to live them, feel them fully, and witness them without flinching. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she realized that the journey ahead would take her deeper into the lives of those who had come before her than she had ever imagined. Every step would be a confrontation with hidden pain, every choice an echo of what had already been made. And somewhere in the shadows of the room, she felt a presence, patient and insistent, waiting for her to take the next step, the step that could either release her or bind her forever to the weight of generations. Mara closed her eyes, bracing herself. She had begun to walk in the lives of others, to feel their choices as if they were her own. And as the room seemed to pulse with memory, a whisper floated across the air, soft but undeniable: the past is alive. And it will not be silent any longer. Chapter 6, Faces in the Shadows. Mara awoke to a world that felt slightly off-kilter, as if the walls of her room had shifted overnight. Sunlight spilled through the curtains, but it seemed thinner, filtered, as though a veil had been drawn over reality. The journal lay open on her bedside table, its pages trembling slightly, as if eager to reveal the next secrets. She touched the worn leather cover, feeling the energy humming beneath her fingers. The echoes had grown stronger since her exploration of the old house. Subtle at first, they had begun to appear in her daily life with a disconcerting clarity. While walking through Lyra's streets, she noticed fleeting faces in the crowd, faces she didn't recognize yet somehow felt intimately familiar. A stranger's laugh would trigger a wave of sorrow, a look of anger would ignite a fear she could not explain. It was as if the past had followed her into the present, manifesting through people she had never met. Compelled to understand, Mara returned to the old house, the journal clutched to her chest. This time, she brought a small lantern, its warm glow cutting through the heavy shadows of the rooms. As she moved through the familiar spaces, she felt the presence of her ancestors more intensely than ever. Each step seemed to echo with the lives that had unfolded here, decisions, regrets, joys, and fears, all layered on top of one another, waiting to be seen. In the parlor, she noticed an old portrait she had never studied closely before. The painted eye seemed almost alive, tracking her movements, reflecting not only her own face but the faint flicker of other figures in the background. She felt herself drawn forward, and as she reached out to touch the frame, the room seemed to breathe. Shadows stretched and shifted, and suddenly the faces in the painting came alive. They moved, spoke in whispers that grazed the edges of her mind, showing her moments of intimacy, betrayal, and fear that had been long buried. Mara realized that the echoes were no longer confined to memory or imagination, they were active, present forces. She could see her grandmother making a choice in a dimly lit kitchen, a choice that had shaped Mara's life in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. She could feel the emotions of ancestors she had never known, as if she were wearing their hearts like second skin. It was overwhelming, yet intoxicating, a connection so deep it was impossible to ignore. She sank to the floor, clutching the journal to her chest, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on her. And then, a subtle shift, a flicker at the corner of her vision, revealed a doorway she had never noticed before, half hidden behind a tapestry. The fabric seemed alive, shimmering faintly as if it were breathing. Mara approached cautiously, heart pounding, and pulled it aside. Beyond the tapestry was a small room, filled with mirrors. Each reflected not her own image alone, but faint, overlapping silhouettes, her grandmother, her great-grandparents, and other ancestors Mara had only read about in the journal. The figures moved independently, yet their eyes always found hers, silently conveying memories and emotions too powerful for words. Mara understood instantly, this was a room where the echoes converged, where the lives of those who had come before her were recorded in essence, waiting to be felt and acknowledged. Mara stepped closer, and the figures began to shift and speak, not with words, but with feeling. Waves of sorrow, regret, and longing washed over her. She felt fear that had been born decades ago, decisions made in desperation, love given and withheld, sacrifices hidden in silence. Each emotion seemed to attach itself to her like invisible threads, intertwining with her own heart, until she could hardly distinguish where her feelings ended and theirs began. She realized that these echoes were not passive, they were living patterns, still active in the world. Some had influenced her choices, her fears, her relationships, even the subtle ways she moved through life. And now, she could confront them directly, feel them fully, and begin to unravel them. But the task seemed monumental, the threads were tangled, powerful, and deeply embedded in the very fabric of her being. Mara's hands trembled as she reached toward a mirror that shimmered differently from the rest. As her fingers brushed its surface, she was pulled into a vision, standing in a room she did not know, witnessing a scene from her grandmother's past. The choices made there, the pain endured and hidden, radiated outward like ripples in water, touching every life that came after. Mara felt the pull of those ripples in her own body, a mixture of grief and clarity, of fear and resolve. When she pulled back from the vision, the room of mirrors was silent again. But Mara knew the echoes had spoken to her, and she had listened. She realized that to untangle the patterns, she would have to walk through more than memories, she would have to experience them, feel them fully, and confront the truths that had been avoided for generations. A sudden chill ran down her spine, and she noticed movement in the corner of the room, shadows that had no reflection, shapes that flickered independently. Mara's pulse quickened. She realized that some echoes were resistant, protective of their secrets, and unwilling to release their hold easily. The past was alive, and it was watching her, testing her resolve. She clutched the journal tightly, whispering to herself that she could endure it, that she could face the shadows, that she could reclaim the life she was meant to live. But as the mirrors shimmered, a single, unfamiliar figure appeared behind the others, a presence she had never encountered, yet somehow instinctively recognized. Its gaze was steady, piercing, and Mara felt a surge of both fear and recognition. The figure stepped closer, and a voice echoed inside her mind, "You have begun to see us, but seeing is only the first step. To walk free, you must face what we have carried, and what you now carry as well." Mara's heart raced. She realized that the journey was no longer about understanding from a distance, it was about immersion, confrontation, and courage. The shadows had faces, the echoes had lives, and the next step would take her deeper into the entwined destinies of her family than she had ever imagined. Chapter 7. Through their eyes Mara woke to a world thick with fog, the edges of reality blurred as though the air itself had become liquid. She could still feel the presence from the mirrors the night before, lingering like a quiet hum beneath her skin. The journal lay open on her bedside table, its pages glowing faintly, as if impatient for her attention. She reached for it, hands trembling, and felt the invisible threads pulling her forward. Determined to understand more fully, Mara returned to the old house. The streets of Lyra were silent, the fog curling around her ankles like restless fingers. Even the familiar cobblestones seemed different, each one humming faintly with memory, as if the town itself were a living record of choices, joys, and sorrows long past. Mara's heart pounded, each step echoing with anticipation and unease. Inside the house, the parlor was quiet, but Mara could feel the energy thickening around her, drawing her toward the mirrors. She approached the one that had shimmered differently the night before, placing her hand against its cool surface. The moment her skin touched the glass, a rush of sensation overtook her. The room around her dissolved, replaced by another scene entirely. She stood in a dimly lit room, smelling the sharp tang of fear and candle smoke. She was no longer herself, yet every movement felt natural, as if her body remembered these motions even though her mind did not. Across the room, a young woman trembled, a familiar trembling, her grandmother, younger, terrified and uncertain. Mara could feel her pulse, her hesitation, her dread. She realized she was seeing life through her grandmother's eyes, living a moment she had never witnessed but had carried unknowingly in her own heart for years. The vision unfolded. Her grandmother faced a decision, one that Mara had read about in letters but could never truly grasp until now. A choice made under duress, a choice meant to protect yet layered with consequences no one had spoken of. Mara felt the anguish and the fear as if it were her own. The walls of the room seemed to pulse with tension, the air electric with emotion. She understood for the first time why certain fears had manifested in her own life, why anxiety, anger, and sorrow had sometimes erupted unbidden. They were echoes of moments like this, etched into her family's history, alive in her body and mind. When the scene ended, Mara stumbled back, breathless. She understood something crucial. To break the patterns, she could not merely observe, she had to feel, fully and without hesitation, the emotions carried across generations. Every decision, every regret, every secret had a pulse, a weight, and now she carried it in her bones. Determined to go deeper, Mara returned to the mirrors again and again, stepping into visions of different ancestors, witnessing critical moments that had shaped the family. A great-uncle's fear in a storm-tossed house, a grandmother's sorrow at an abandoned home, a mother's quiet rage at betrayals never named, all of it was alive, tangible, and pressing into Mara's consciousness. She began to recognize the subtle ways these moments had rippled through time, shaping her own reactions, her own choices, her own fears. Each vision left her exhausted yet oddly empowered. She realized that understanding the echoes required courage, not just curiosity, but willingness to feel grief, fear, and anger as if they were her own. And as she stepped out of each scene, returning to her own body, she carried fragments of those lives with her, woven into her being, heavy and luminous at once. One evening, as she explored a vision of her grandmother sitting alone in a candlelit room, Mara noticed something strange. A shadow lingered behind the figure, subtle at first, then clearer, her presence distinct from her grandmother's, observing, influencing. Mara felt a chill. The shadow seemed alive, not merely a memory but an active part of the pattern, a force that had directed choices, amplified fears, and whispered secrets. She realized that some echoes were not passive, they were guardians of old pain, resistant to release. Mara's hand shook as she touched the shadow in the vision, trying to confront it. It recoiled, then circled her grandmother's form like a predator, a silent reminder that not all truths were easily faced. She understood that untangling these patterns would require more than observation and empathy, it would require confrontation, courage, and perhaps sacrifice. Returning from the vision, Mara sank to the floor, the journal opened before her. She felt the weight of generations pressing against her chest, yet she also felt a spark, a quiet determination growing in the core of her being. The echoes were alive, persistent, and demanding. They were the voices of lives lived fully, choices made under pressure, and pain passed silently across decades. And now, they had called her to witness, to feel, to confront, and perhaps, to heal. As she closed the journal, a soft whisper threaded through the room, faint but unmistakable: "You are not alone. But the hardest truths are still waiting." Mara's pulse quickened. She understood that the journey would not be over until she faced the moments that had shaped her family most profoundly, and until she faced the shadows within herself that had been born from those choices. And as the fog thickened outside, curling against the walls of the old house like living fingers, Mara felt a stirring of both fear and resolve. The echoes were alive, waiting, and the next step would take her deeper than she had ever imagined, into secrets, into sorrow, and into the hidden patterns that had shaped her very soul. Chapter 8, Unraveling Threads. The fog hung thick over Lyra, curling through the streets like restless spirits. Mara walked with the journal pressed to her chest, heart hammering as though every beat echoed the lives of those who had come before her. She could feel the weight of a generation settling into her shoulders, heavy but strangely alive. Every emotion she had carried in recent days, grief, fear, anger, now pulsed through her with new intensity, as though the echoes themselves had become tangible. Determined to do more than simply witness, Mara returned to the old house at the edge of town. She had realized that seeing the past was only the first step. To truly release the echoes, she would have to intervene in some small way. She would have to acknowledge the pain, the secrets, the regrets, and offer them something they had never received: recognition, compassion, understanding. Inside the house, the air was thick with memory. Dust motes danced in the beams of her lantern, and shadows clung to corners as if guarding their secrets. Mara wandered into the parlor, where the mirrors awaited her. She hesitated, her reflection multiplied endlessly, each image holding fragments of the lives she had already glimpsed. She took a deep breath and spoke aloud, her voice trembling but firm: "I see you. I feel you. I honor what you carried." The mirror shivered, and for a moment, Mara thought she had imagined it. But then, shapes began to move, faint at first, then clearer. Faces she had never met but somehow recognized turned toward her, expressions softening as though relieved to be acknowledged. A surge of warmth spread through Mara, and she felt a thread loosen in her chest, a tiny weight lifted from her body. And encouraged, Mara focused on one shadow, the one that had resisted her touch in previous visions. She reached out with intention, imagining compassion and understanding flowing through her fingers. The shadow recoiled, writhing, resisting, but she held her ground. Slowly, inch by inch, it softened, curling toward her as if seeking something it had never known. Acceptance. Hours passed like minutes. Mara moved from one mirror to another, confronting threads of sorrow, anger, fear, and longing. She traced the invisible lines of trauma, feeling each ancestor's life pulse through her. Some threads unraveled easily with acknowledgment, others resisted, whispering secrets, testing her resolve, reminding her of the depth of the pain carried across generations. By late evening, Mara was exhausted. Her hand shook, her mind swam with images of lives she had walked in, hearts she had felt. Yet beneath the fatigue, there was a deep, almost radiant sense of possibility. She had begun to untangle the threads, to lift the invisible burdens, to give voice to the emotions that had been silenced for decades. Then, as she rested on the floor, a new presence made itself known. It was stronger, darker than the others, a shadow that seemed to pulse with anger and fear. Mara realized with a jolt that some echoes were not just memories, they were active forces, still bound to the choices they had witnessed and made. This one, in particular, seemed to resist everything she tried, radiating a sense of danger and urgency. Mara's heart pounded. She understood that not all shadows could be soothed with recognition alone. Some required courage, confrontation, and perhaps sacrifice. She could feel the tension tighten around her chest, the threads pulling at her very being, warning her that the past would not release its hold willingly. But Mara also felt a spark of defiance. The journal had shown her the way, the river had whispered guidance, the mirrors had reflected truth. She could endure the resistance. She could face the anger, the grief, the fear. She had begun to unravel the threads, and now, she would confront the ones that had been hidden the longest, the ones that had shaped her life most profoundly. As she rose to face the dark shadow, it surged forward, swirling like smoke, its presence almost suffocating. Mara's fingers trembled as she lifted them toward the shape, heart hammering in her chest. And in that moment, a voice, soft, insistent, familiar, echoed in her mind: "The threads you untangle will change everything. But some shadows will not yield without a struggle." Mara inhaled deeply, bracing herself. She understood now that this was more than discovery, more than empathy. This was confrontation, an encounter with the very essence of inherited pain. And as the shadow coiled around her like a living storm, Mara felt the first true test of her courage and the first promise of freedom. Chapter 9. The first break. The fog outside Mara's window had lifted slightly, leaving the town of Lyra washed in a pale, trembling light. But inside her chest, the storm of echoes raged more fiercely than ever. The dark shadow she had confronted the night before lingered in her mind, a coil of anger and fear that refused to release its grip. Mara knew she could not turn away now. The threads of generations were alive, and they demanded engagement, confrontation, and understanding. She returned to the old house, journal clutched tightly, hands trembling with both anticipation and fear. The mirrors awaited her, each reflecting fragments of lives she had touched, threads of sorrow and hope intertwined. Mara took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of the past in her veins, and stepped forward. This time, she would not merely observe, she would act, acknowledge, and release. She began with a shadow she had grown familiar with, the one born of grief and resignation, a thread that had quietly shaped her own fears and hesitations. Mara spoke aloud, her voice steady but soft. I see you. I honor your sorrow. You no longer need to carry this alone. For a moment, nothing happened. The shadow hovered, resistant, testing her resolve. Then, slowly, it began to soften, shimmering and twisting until it dissipated, leaving behind a faint glow. Mara felt an immediate lightness in her chest, a space that had been heavy for years suddenly clear. The first thread had unraveled. Encouraged, she moved to another shadow, one steeped in anger and betrayal. She reached toward it, imagining compassion and acknowledgment flowing into its core. The shadow recoiled violently, coiling like a living storm, but Mara held her ground. She breathed steadily, feeling the echo of pain and fear, and slowly, the shadow began to uncoil, surrendering its grip. By the time she stepped back, her body hummed with a strange warmth, a sign that the first true liberation had been achieved, yet the triumph was fragile. Mara sensed other threads stirring, awakened by the release. Shadows that had lain dormant began to move, whispering warnings, testing her resolve. She realized that breaking one chain awakened others, ripples that demanded attention, courage, and patience. The echoes were alive, interconnected, and infinitely complex. As she approached the largest shadow, the one that had resisted her the longest, Mara's heart pounded. This presence radiated all the unresolved fear, anger, and secrecy of her grandmother's life, amplified by the choices of ancestors she had never known. The shadow surged, coiling around her like a living storm, nearly overwhelming her. Mara's fingers shook as she reached out, but this time she felt something new, a spark of connection, a recognition that this was not an enemy, but a part of herself she had been carrying unknowingly. She breathed deeply, imagining understanding and acceptance flowing through her, allowing herself to feel the emotions fully: grief, rage, sorrow, longing, fear. The shadow quivered, then began to unravel slowly, threads loosening, tension easing. Mara felt the energy shift, a surge of lightness she had never known in her chest. The first major pattern had been released, but as the shadow dissolved, Mara noticed something unexpected. The mirror shimmered, revealing other presences she had not seen before, threads that had been hidden, buried under layers of denial and secrecy. Some were familiar, faint echoes she had brushed past, others were entirely new, vibrant and insistent. The release of one pattern had awakened many others, and the work ahead was far from over. Mara sank to the floor, chest heaving, hands pressed against her temples. She felt the weight of triumph and exhaustion, the exhilaration of freedom tempered by the awareness of the journey still before her. The echoes were alive, persistent, and interconnected. Each thread untangled revealed another, and she understood that healing was not a single act, but an unfolding process, a journey through the lives and choices of those who had come before. And then, as she rested, a whisper floated through the room, soft and insistent, yet unmistakably clear: "You have begun. But the past still waits for its reckoning. Are you ready to see what has been hidden the longest?" Mara's pulse quickened. She realized that this first victory, though profound, was only the beginning. The echoes were stirring, and the shadows that had remained silent for decades were now beginning to awaken. The path ahead was uncertain, full of fear, revelation, and confrontation, but Mara knew she could not turn back. Chapter 10. The shadow that wouldn't yield. Mara entered the old house with a sense of dread and determination intertwined. The air was thick, almost electric, as if the building itself knew what awaited her. She carried the journal tightly against her chest, feeling the pulse of generations vibrating beneath her fingers. Today, she would confront the shadow that had resisted her every attempt, the one tied to the deepest secret of her grandmother's life, a secret that had shaped Mara in ways she had only begun to understand. The mirrors in the parlor shimmered with energy, reflecting fragments of lives lived long before her. Mara approached the one that had always seemed different, darker, more impenetrable. Her own reflection stared back at her, but there was something behind it, something that shifted and breathed, alive and waiting. She could feel the intensity of the shadow, radiating fear, shame, and unspoken pain. Her pulse raced, hands trembling, yet she stepped closer as she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I see you. I feel you. I honor your pain." The shadow reacted instantly, surging forward like a living storm. Mara staggered back, the force nearly knocking her off her feet. The room seemed to distort, the walls bending, the mirrors vibrating as if they were alive. The shadow carried the weight of decades, of choices hidden and secrets buried, and it resisted every attempt at acknowledgment. Mara could feel it pressing into her chest, into her mind, threatening to overwhelm her entirely, but Mara remembered the river, the mirrors, the moments of liberation she had achieved before. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and let herself feel the shadow fully, not as an enemy, but as a part of the past that had been passed down to her. She allowed the grief, anger, and fear to flow into her body, imagining understanding and compassion streaming through her. The shadow writhed and twisted, testing her courage, pushing her to the brink. Mara's knees quaked, her hands trembled, but she did not retreat. She spoke again, louder this time, "You do not need to control me. I carry your pain, but I am not bound by it. I see you. I honor you. And now, I release you." For a long, suspended moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the shadow began to change. It shimmered, the darkness lightening, threads of fear and anger loosening. Mara could feel the shift in her own chest, the invisible chains easing their grip. The room seemed to breathe, the mirrors reflecting not just her image, but the faces of ancestors softened by recognition. As the shadow dissipated, Mara felt a strange clarity she had never known. A weight she had carried unknowingly for decades lifted from her chest, leaving a lightness that was almost dizzying. She realized, with a mixture of awe and exhaustion, that she had faced the most entrenched, most resistant echo of her family's past, and survived it. Yet even in triumph, Mara sensed the work was not complete. The mirrors revealed faint new presences, smaller threads that had been hidden beneath layers of grief and secrecy. They whispered, subtle but insistent, suggesting that while one of the deepest shadows had been released, many others still lingered, waiting for acknowledgement. The past, Mara realized, was alive, vast, and patient. She sank to the floor, hands pressed to her chest, feeling the surge of relief and exhaustion coursing through her. The room was quiet, but the air thrummed with possibility. For the first time, she felt the potential for true liberation, a glimpse of freedom from patterns that had shaped her life for decades. And then, just as she began to rest, a soft, urgent whisper threaded through the air, "You have done what few dare. But the threads are endless, and the truth still waits. Will you continue?" Mara's heart pounded. She knew the path ahead would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. She had faced the darkest shadow and released it, but the journey through her family's hidden past was far from over. And somewhere deep inside, she felt a stirring of anticipation mingled with fear, an understanding that the next steps would take her to the very edge of what she could endure, and perhaps beyond. Chapter 11. The Web of Echoes. Mara awoke with the lingering weight of the shadows she had faced the night before, but also with a new sense of clarity. The release of the deepest shadow had left her chest lighter, yet her mind buzzed with images, memories, and threads she could barely comprehend. It was as if the past had stretched its arms further than she had realized, weaving a web that connected every ancestor, every choice, every unspoken sorrow directly to her. She returned to the old house once more, journal in hand. The mirrors reflected her image, but this time, something had shifted. Threads of light now intertwined among the reflections, connecting faces, expressions, and gestures across generations. Mara could see the invisible web, the echoes linking her life to countless others. She reached out, running her fingers along the glass, and felt the threads vibrate, alive and pulsing, as if the house itself were a living network of memory. Mara began to trace the threads, following the flow of emotion from one life to the next. She saw how a moment of anger in her great-grandfather's youth had spiraled through decades, touching her grandmother, her mother, and eventually herself. She watched sorrow pass silently, shaping fears and insecurities she had thought were hers alone. She felt relief as she acknowledged the patterns, understanding that seeing and feeling them was the first step toward freedom. Yet the web was vast and tangled. As Mara moved from thread to thread, she realized that releasing one pattern sometimes awakened others. Shadows she had not seen before flickered at the edges of her vision, whispering secrets and demanding attention. Some were gentle, like a sigh of grief finally recognized; others were sharp, like a sting of anger or betrayal seeking acknowledgement. The threads were living, dynamic, and persistent. In one mirror, Mara saw her grandmother as a young woman, making a choice that had ripple effects for generations. The room shimmered around her, and Mara felt herself step into the scene, feeling the fear, the hope, and the grief as if it were her own. She understood now that the echoes were not simply memories, they were experiences, alive and active, influencing the present until fully confronted. Mara's hands trembled as she touched another thread, linking her own small moments of hesitation and anxiety to events that had occurred decades before she was born. The connection was intimate and astonishing. She realized that understanding the web required both courage and empathy, a willingness to experience emotions not her own without resistance. Hours passed in this trance-like state. Mara moved from thread to thread, witnessing joy and heartbreak, courage and regret, betrayal and love. She began to see patterns emerge, cycles repeating themselves through generations. And with each acknowledgement, each act of recognition, the web shifted, loosening its grip on her. She felt herself breathing more freely, walking more lightly, yet aware that some threads were still tight, resistant, alive with secrets that demanded deeper engagement. Then, in a moment that made her heart seize, Mara noticed a thread unlike any other. It pulsed with intensity, radiating fear and shame so familiar it felt almost like her own heartbeat. She followed it through the mirrors, through generations, until she saw the moment her grandmother had carried the secret that had influenced every other thread in the web. It was the choice that had bound generations, the decision made in love but layered with unspoken pain, the moment that had shaped not only her grandmother's life but Mara's own in ways she had never fully understood it. The shadow was immense, almost alive, writhing and pulsing with resistance. Mara's pulse quickened. She understood that this was the ultimate test of her journey, the thread that held the web together, the secret that had shaped her family and herself. To release it, she would have to confront it fully, to experience the emotions, the fear, the grief, the shame, and the love intertwined within it. Mara took a deep breath, gripping the journal to her chest. The whispers of the past surrounded her, the threads humming, the shadows shifting. She realized that confronting this moment would not just release one shadow, it would ripple through the entire web, changing lives, patterns, and echoes across generations. And as she reached toward the shadow, a voice whispered in her mind, calm yet insistent, "The heart of the web awaits. Are you ready to carry the truth?" Mara's pulse raced, a mixture of fear and resolve surging through her. She knew that this step could transform everything, but it also demanded courage beyond anything she had faced. The web of echoes pulsed around her, alive, insistent, waiting. And in that moment, Mara understood that the journey was reaching its most crucial turning point, the point where the past, present, and future converged, and where true liberation was possible, or perilously close to slipping away. Chapter 12, The Heart of the Web. The house was quiet, almost reverent, as Mara stepped into the parlor one last time. The mirror shimmered with faint light, threads of silver weaving through every reflection, connecting faces, gestures, and moments across generations. Mara felt the pulse of the past in her veins, a living rhythm that had been her companion, her challenge, and now, her guide. Today, she would confront the heart of the web, the secret that had bound her family for decades. Her hands trembled as she reached for the journal, tracing the worn edges. She remembered every step of the journey, the river where the threads first revealed themselves, the shadows she had faced and softened, the release of anger, grief, and fear that had begun to unburden her soul. But this step was different. This was not just release, it was confrontation, immersion, and integration. The ultimate thread pulsed before her, alive and almost tangible, radiating fear, shame, longing, and love in equal measure. Mara took a deep breath, letting herself feel the energy of the shadow fully. She stepped closer, heart hammering, and whispered aloud, "I see you. I honor you. I am ready." The shadow surged, coiling around her like smoke and wind combined, almost overwhelming her senses. She could feel the weight of choices made in desperation, sacrifices unspoken, pain hidden behind smiles and silences. It was overwhelming, yet in the center of the storm, Mara felt a spark of recognition. This was not an enemy, but a piece of herself, a fragment of her grandmother, a living echo of generations. And Mara let herself feel everything, the fear, the sorrow, the love, the hope. She imagined threads of understanding and acceptance flowing through her, connecting past and present, weaving the fractured pieces together. The shadow quivered, then began to unwind, releasing its grip. Threads of pain dissolved into light, echoes softened into whispers of gratitude, and Mara felt the first true sense of liberation in her chest. The mirrors pulsed and shimmered, reflecting faces softened by acknowledgement, generations connected by understanding, shadows dissolving into light. Mara's body tingled with energy, a sense of weightlessness replacing the burden she had carried for years. The echoes had not vanished, they had been integrated, recognized, honored. She had witnessed, felt, and released, weaving herself into the web in a way that brought coherence, clarity, and freedom. But even in the glow of triumph, Mara noticed faint threads still shimmering at the edges, smaller, subtler echoes that had not yet been fully expressed. The past, she realized, was infinite. Patterns would always exist, some hidden, some waiting to be acknowledged. Healing was not a single act but a living, ongoing process. And Mara understood that she could now meet it with courage, awareness, and compassion. She stepped back from the mirrors, breathing deeply, feeling the pulse of life, choice, and emotion in her own veins. For the first time, she felt fully present in her body, fully alive in her mind, fully at peace with the echoes she carried. The house seemed to exhale with her, the walls glowing softly, the shadows gentle, the threads of generations settled into harmony. Mara opened the journal one last time, her fingers tracing the lines of handwriting she had come to know intimately. She smiled, not with relief alone, but with profound understanding. The journey had transformed her, not by removing the echoes, but by teaching her to live with them, to honor them, and to release their hold over her life. And as she left the house, stepping into the streets of Lyra bathed in soft sunlight, Mara felt a quiet thrill. The echoes of the past were no longer chains, they were threads of wisdom, courage, and love she could carry forward. The town seemed brighter, lighter, yet still alive with memory. Mara knew she would never forget the journey, the shadows, the whispers. She had faced them all, and in doing so, had discovered the profound power of seeing, feeling, and acknowledging what had come before. A soft wind stirred the leaves in the trees, whispering in a language she could almost understand, the past is alive. The future is yours. And the threads you carry will guide what is yet to come. Mara walked on, heart steady, mind clear, carrying the web of echoes within her, but now, for the first time, free. Thanks for listening. If this journey into the mind and hidden patterns resonated with you, we'd love to hear from you. Which audiobook should we explore next on Momentum Mind? Drop your suggestion in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story that can transform the way you think and live.